On that cold early morning, between sirens and flickering lights, an invisible thread connected two lonely souls. She, unknowingly, already carried his future in her hands. And he, even unconscious, had already begun to forget what it felt like to live without someone to trust. But for someone who only knew abandonment, learning to trust would be the hardest battle of all. The dawn wrapped the city in a fine, persistent rain, turning the streets into deserted mirrors of light. Katie adjusted her backpack as she stepped out of the hospital after another exhausting shift. The smell of wet asphalt and the rhythmic tapping of raindrops pulled her into a silent bubble. Suddenly, the sharp screech of tires tore through the air, making her instinctively turn toward the avenue. A sleek black car skidded out of control before crashing violently into a pole. The impact echoed like muffled thunder, and Katie ran without thinking, her sneakers soaking in the pooled water. As she approached, she saw the crumpled hood and the key, flickering headlights like a failing heartbeat. Inside, a man lay unconscious, his face partially covered in blood, bearing a strangely peaceful, almost sorrowful expression. She yanked the door open with effort, the smell of gasoline mixing with rain and rust. "Hey, sir, hang in there," she said, trying to fight back the panic as she checked his vital signs. Her trembling hands dialed emergency services while her mind screamed not to let fear take over. She pressed an improvised compress to his forehead using her jacket, ignoring the blood staining her sleeves. The man's eyes flickered open for a brief moment, cloudy blue and lost, before he passed out again. Katie spoke to the dispatcher, describing the location, begging them to hurry as time slipped through her fingers. The world shrank to just the two of them, with nothing but the rain and the faint rhythm of his heartbeat filling the space. When the ambulance arrived, Katie hesitated to let go of his hand, as if breaking that invisible thread. The paramedics gently pulled her back, but not before she noticed their surprised expression upon seeing the patient. "Oh my God, that's David Walker," one of them whispered, eyes wide in disbelief. Katie frowned. The name didn't mean much to her, but their reaction made it clear he was someone important. From a distance, she watched them place David on the stretcher, the world already beginning to turn his accident into a spectacle. At the hospital, chaos erupted like dry brush catching fire the moment his identity was revealed. Reporters swarmed, outside, their camera flashes lighting up the night like artificial lightning. Still in her uniform, Katie stayed close, a protective instinct growing stronger with every second. David, vulnerable and alone, looked small in that hospital bed, so far from the powerful image the world had of him. He was just a wounded man now, with scars both seen and unseen, ones no one else seemed to notice. As the doctors worked to stabilize David, Katie refused to leave, even though her shift had long ended. She pulled a chair into a quiet corner and sat watching silently, the hum of machines filling the air. Every crease on his face seemed to tell a story she didn't know, yet somehow it hurt her too. The expensive watch on his wrist contrasted starkly with her own soaked and simple clothing, and yet Katie saw more than wealth. She saw a man bearing the weight of something far heavier than an accident. Hours passed slowly until the slight movement of his hand made her leap from her chair. David groaned, trying to shift, his eyes blinking, against the harsh white light. Katie stepped closer, unsure whether to speak or simply be there, a quiet presence beside him. He turned his head toward her, eyes half open, filled with pain and confusion. Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough, more fragile than she'd ever expect from a business giant. "I'm just someone who happened to be passing by," Katie replied, her voice as soft as the rain still falling outside. David blinked, trying to process, but the medication soon dragged him back into unconsciousness. Katie remained there for a moment longer, unsure why it all felt so significant. With a deep sigh, she turned away, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway, antiseptic scent clinging to her senses. And as she left the hospital, one quiet certainty settled deep in her chest. That night had changed everything. The rising sun painted the city in cold golden tones as David opened his eyes for the second time. The room felt strange, clinical, and the constant beeping of the monitors was like an annoying hum in the background. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his ribs forced him to recline with a groan. That's when he saw Katie standing at the door, her uniform wrinkled and her gaze alert. She didn't say a word, just tilted her head slightly in acknowledgement. "You were there?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and wary. "Yes," Katie replied, her gaze steady, without the greedy gleam he had learned to expect in others. David studied her like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Why would someone like her, simple, unpretentious, be there, expecting nothing in return? He was used to hidden agendas. He had no idea how to deal with anything else. The doctor walked in, breaking the silence thick with unspoken questions. After a brief examination, he explained the moderate severity of David's injuries. He was strong, they said. Could have died if he hadn't been rescued so quickly. David listened silently, jaw clenched, unwilling to show weakness in front of anyone. But when the doctor left, his eyes drifted almost unwillingly back to Katie. She was still there, as if life itself had stitched their presence together by some invisible thread. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice laced with something between defiance and resignation. "I do," Katie replied simply without lowering her gaze. And in that quiet answer, without flattery or fear, David found something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. Genuine respect. The kind that wasn't bought or begged for. Outside the room, chaos brewed. Journalists circled the hospital, like vultures over a carcass. The news spread fast, the reclusive tycoon involved in a mysterious accident. David closed his eyes, frustrated by the inevitable invasion of his privacy. He didn't want friends, advice, or shallow sympathy. He just wanted silence. And somehow, surprisingly, he found that in Katie. Days passed, and her presence became a quiet constant, almost imperceptible. Sometimes they exchanged a few words, sometimes just glances that held weight. One cold dawn, David asked what she did outside the hospital. "I survive," she answered with a small smile, unashamed of her raw honesty. That answer echoed inside him long after she left the room. David began to observe Katie differently, noticing every detail. The way she folded blankets with care, how she spoke gently to elderly patients. She did nothing for recognition. She did it because it felt right. And for a man who had lived surrounded by fake loyalty, that was disarming. Katie was real, tangible, and dangerously hard to ignore. One night, as rain drummed once more against the hospital windows, David called her in again. "Why do you do this? Why do you care?" The question came out broken, weighted with buried vulnerabilities. Katie simply smiled, a smile full of invisible scars. "Not everyone needs a reason to care," she said softly before walking away. David stared at the closed door long after she was gone. He, who owned the entire world, was beginning to realize the emptiness it left inside him, and this ordinary woman, with her quiet strength, was slowly filling spaces he hadn't known were empty. Restlessness bloomed in his chest, an unease unlike any business deal lost. It was fear of losing something he didn't even know he'd started to gain. David was discharged from the hospital a week later against medical advice. He could no longer bear the feeling of vulnerability, even though his body protested every step. Dressed in sober clothes, his expression was cold, a walking fortress more than a man. A light rain followed him to the waiting limousine, where his driver stood in silence. Katie, watching from the hospital entrance, felt a strange ache of goodbye tighten in her chest. She knew his world was untouchable, built with invisible walls and silent codes. Still, she couldn't help but think she'd never see him again. And maybe that was for the best. Katie didn't belong to that universe of numbers, spotlights, and false intentions. She belonged to the worn streets of Brooklyn, to endless shifts, to raw reality. Swallowing her premature nostalgia, she turned and walked back to work. Inside the limo, David stared at the foggy window, lost in thoughts he dared not name. Katie's face kept appearing in his mind like a stubborn memory, a beam of light through the storm. He tried to rationalize what he felt, but grew more irritated with the lack of control. She's just a nurse, he told himself. A brief moment, a detour. But deep down he knew it wasn't just that. It never had been. Days later, a charity event forced him out of his reluctant seclusion. It was to support a non-profit that helped at-risk youth, something his late mother had championed. David hated those events. Fake smiles, calculated glances, hollow praise. But the weight of his mother's memory compelled him to attend and play the part. Dressed immaculately in a tailored suit, he looked untouchable, unreachable. Katie, on the other hand, had never stepped into such a luxurious venue in her life. Her hospital had been invited to receive a small tribute for partnering with the nonprofit. Reluctantly, she agreed to go, wearing the only decent dress she owned. Simple, navy blue and elegant. As soon as she walked in, she felt out of place like a piece from the wrong puzzle. But she lifted her chin, determined not to let the setting make her forget who she was. While chatting with some colleagues, Katie didn't notice someone watching her from afar. David, standing among bored businessmen, saw her walk in, and the world lost focus. She was like a breath of truth in that glittering, suffocating theater. Without thinking, he began to walk toward her, his steps deliberate and silent. Every inch between them crackled with restrained electricity. Feeling the heat of an intense gaze, Katie turned and saw him. David's eyes, once cold and calculating, now burned with something else. She held her breath for a second, her heart pounding erratically. It wasn't fear. It was the silent recognition of something growing between them, something neither could control, but neither could ignore. As he approached, the world around them seemed to blur, the noise fading into a distant hum. "You again," David said, his voice deep and unexpectedly soft, almost a conspiratorial whisper. "I could say the same," Katie replied with a small, honest smile, one without submission. His smile was nearly imperceptible, a fleeting glimpse of hidden humanity. And in that moment, without more than a few exchanged words, a new story began to write itself. Before they could say anything else, a reporter approached, camera in hand, sniffing for scandal. David immediately stiffened, his instinctual walls snapping back into place. Katie noticed the shift, the inner retreat, and made a bold, impulsive decision. She grabbed his hand discreetly and pulled him into a side corridor, away from the spotlight. David, caught off guard, followed, her touch burning like fire and ice on his skin. When they stopped, hidden from the cameras, both were silent for a long moment. The dimly lit hallway felt like a parallel universe, where only the two of them existed. "You didn't have to save me," David said, his hoarse voice carrying more gratitude than he was willing to admit. "Maybe I'm just used to saving people who don't even know they need saving," Katie replied, her eyes shining. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with dangerous possibilities. David took a step closer, breaking the safe distance between them. Katie caught the faint scent of his cologne, mingled with the warmth of his overwhelming presence. Her heart pounded, echoing in her ears like a frantic, uneven melody. For a second, she thought he might kiss her right there, beneath the flickering light of that forgotten hallway. But David stopped just inches away, eyes locked on hers, as if silently asking for permission. "I don't know how to be close to someone like you," he murmured, the confession escaping without filter. Katie smiled, a sad and sweet smile, the kind that understands pain without needing words. "Then don't try to understand it now. Just be here," she whispered back. David closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to imprint those words deep into his soul. And in that moment, without their lips ever touching, they sealed something invisible and eternal between them. That night, David couldn't sleep, twisting under expensive sheets that felt more like a prison. Katie's face came back in stubborn flashes, her quiet smile, her disarming gaze. He, who was used to controlling everything, felt utterly vulnerable in front of her simplicity. It was as if she had found cracks in him he hadn't known existed. And that scared him more than any billion-dollar loss ever could. At the hospital, Katie wrestled with thoughts she wished she didn't have. She knew David belonged to a world completely different from hers. She knew getting too close could mean getting hurt in ways she might not survive. Still, something inside her, irrational and deep, refused to step back. Something in her had already recognized the hidden loneliness in his eyes. In the days that followed, David made an anonymous donation to the hospital where Katie worked. The staff buzzed with excitement, trying to guess the identity of the mysterious benefactor. Katie knew immediately who it was, and something in her chest tightened. She didn't want charity, didn't want to be anyone's guilty conscience. She didn't need saving, especially not from him. When David sought her out again, it was Katie who put up the walls. They met casually at a small, quiet coffee shop, far from the spotlight. He tried to start a conversation, but she kept her distance, polite, almost cold. "I'm not for sale," she said plainly, looking him directly in the eyes. David stepped back, as if hit by an invisible blow. "I didn't mean. That wasn't my intention," he tried to explain, stumbling over his own words. Katie took a deep breath, trying to control the storm of anger and fear inside her. She wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment had made her cautious. "Don't try to buy what you can't control," she said, rising from her chair. David remained seated, stunned, watching her disappear through the door like a shattered dream. The days that followed were a silent torture for both of them. David drowned himself in work, trying to bury Katie's memory in spreadsheets and meetings. But every decision felt hollow, every signature heavier than the last. Katie, meanwhile, buried herself in long shifts, pretending she didn't miss him. But in the quiet of the night, the emptiness spoke louder than any denial. One afternoon, as Katie left the hospital, she found David waiting outside. He was leaning against a black car, his suit rumpled, deep shadows under his eyes. For a moment, she wanted to run, flee from the pain written all over him. But something kept her rooted to the spot, something stronger than pride. "We need to talk," he said, his voice deep and rough with exhaustion. Katie crossed her arms, bracing herself against the emotional storm building inside. "About what? About how you think everything can be solved with money?" David closed his eyes, her words like daggers, but he didn't back away. "About the fact that for the first time in years I don't know what to do," he confessed. Katie blinked, surprised by the raw honesty bleeding from his voice. They sat on a nearby bench, under a gray sky that mirrored their hearts. For long minutes they said nothing, just listened to each other's breath. Finally, David spoke, the words sounding more like a confession than a conversation. "I don't know how to love normally. Everything in me was trained to negotiate, not to trust." Katie felt her eyes burn, but she stayed strong, listening with her heart wide open. "I'm not perfect either," she said, her voice low and trembling. "I learned early that trusting too much is a recipe for pain." David looked up, meeting her gaze, one filled with as many scars as his own. And in that moment, they were no longer millionaire and nurse, just two broken souls trying to find each other. Two lives so different yet connected by pain, fear, and hope. When they parted that night, there were no promises or cinematic kisses. There was only a firm, honest handshake, a silent truce. It was small, perhaps, to anyone watching from the outside, but to them it was the beginning of something that words still couldn't name, something already changing who they were, and who they could become. David remained seated long after she'd gone, staring at the nearly empty street. The scent of rain hung in the air, blending with the bitter taste of regret in his mouth. He knew he could no longer treat Katie like just another passing face in his life. She was different, and maybe it was that very difference that scared him the most. For the first time, He feared he might not be enough for what was growing between them. Katie walked quickly along the wet sidewalks, her heart racing in confusion. Part of her wanted to protect herself, to raise even higher walls against the pain she sensed coming. Another part, quieter, more stubborn, wanted to believe David could be different. But trust was a risk she'd learned to fear from a very young age, and now she felt caught in the middle of an emotional storm she couldn't control. The next day, David sent a simple message to Katie. "Can I try to get it right this time?" Katie stared at the screen for minutes, torn between reason and the hope creeping into her chest. She didn't reply right away, letting silence speak for her in that moment. She needed time. She needed proof that he wanted more than to shatter her safe world. And deep down, she needed to prove to herself that she could still believe. David, respecting her space, chose to act differently from what he was used to. Instead of lavish flowers or opulent gifts, he began showing up discreetly at the nonprofit Katie supported. He took part in simple events, talked to teenagers who would never dream of stepping into his glass-walled offices. There, far from the spotlight, David began to rediscover something he'd lost: humanity. And every small gesture was a quiet attempt to draw closer to her world. Katie, watching from afar, noticed the changes without knowing exactly how to react. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he seemed to be genuinely trying to be better. She saw it in the small things: a patient smile, advice given without arrogance, real differences. And with each passing day, the wall around her heart grew a little less unbreakable. But fear still lingered, a ghost haunting her every step. One cold Sunday afternoon, they bumped into each other in an old neighborhood park. David was holding a paper bag of donations, clumsy, almost ordinary in his vulnerability. Katie smiled involuntarily when she saw him stumble, trying to balance everything in his hands. Without thinking, she stepped closer and took part of the load, their fingers brushing for an instant. That brief touch was enough to reignite all the electricity held between them. I'm trying," David said awkwardly, his eyes shining with disarming sincerity. "I know," Katie replied with a small smile, feeling her inner defenses give way a little more. They walked together to the nonprofit's entrance, sharing short stories and shy smiles. No grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the slow construction of trust. And sometimes Katie thought it was those little moments that truly mattered. While helping to organize the donated goods, David was surprised by the lightness of it all. There, between boxes and laughing children, he felt more real than in any boardroom. Katie watched him quietly, seeing the man behind the empire, not the empire behind the man, and something within her, something old and dormant, began to believe in second chances again. Maybe, she thought, he wasn't the only one who needed one. At the end of the day, as they said goodbye at the nonprofit's door, Katie did something that surprised them both. She stepped closer and placed a soft kiss on David's cheek. A simple gesture, yet full of meaning. David froze for a second, absorbing the warmth of that unexpected touch. The smile that grew on his face was unlike any other, genuine, unguarded. And for the first time in a long while, Katie felt that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to take a risk. Their routine of casual encounters and quiet conversations gradually brought them closer. Though neither dared take a bigger step, the connection between them was undeniable. It was as if every hidden smile and accidental touch held a silent promise of something more. But where feelings bloom, fear often lurks, ready to test fragile foundations. And both of their fears were about to be put to the test. One afternoon, while Katie was organizing medicine at the hospital's pharmacy, she was urgently summoned. Her boss, the director of the institution, wanted to see her in the conference room immediately. When she arrived, she found not only him but also a tabloid journalist smiling like a vulture. "We'd like to know, Miss Campbell, about your relationship with David Walker," the reporter asked bluntly. The floor felt like it gave way beneath her feet. Her breath caught in her throat. Katie felt the blood drain from her face as she met the director's gaze, waiting for her answer. She wasn't naive. She knew any wrong word could cost her everything. "There is no relationship," she said firmly, her voice calm despite the storm inside her. The reporter, clearly disappointed, pressed on with questions disguised as curiosity, but Katie held her ground, protecting her own dignity and David's at all costs. Meanwhile, David was informed that his friendship with a nurse had leaked to the media. Furious, he threw his phone against his office wall, the shattered screen mirroring his frustration. He knew Katie wasn't to blame, he knew. But years of betrayal and manipulation had left him unable to trust completely, and old instincts of self-preservation began to take over. Without thinking, David called Katie that same night. She answered, her voice tired but gentle as always. "Did you tell anyone?" he asked, cutting straight to the point, his voice like stone. The silence on the other end cut through the night like a knife. "No," she said softly, with a sadness he could feel even without seeing her. Katie hung up before the tears could betray her strength, a bitter ache swelling in her chest. Trusting was hard. Being doubted after offering trust was devastating. David, alone in his penthouse, stared at the phone as if it could return his courage. He realized he might be making the same mistake that had condemned him to loneliness for years. But pride, his old companion, kept him from going after her. 2 days passed in a sepulchral silence between them, like a wall built word by unsaid word. Katie buried herself in work, refusing to surrender to the pain tearing her apart. David tried to convince himself this was for the best, that protecting himself was safer. But each night without the lightness of her presence made his world feel emptier, more unbearable. Katie's absence wasn't just physical, it was an emptiness within him. Then, on a rainy Friday, Katie received an unexpected visitor at the hospital. It was David. No bodyguards, no luxury cars, just a man drenched in guilt and longing. She saw him standing at the entrance, soaked suit clinging to his body, eyes lost. For a moment she wanted to turn away, to protect herself from more pain. But something inside her, maybe love, maybe compassion, wouldn't let her. Without a word, Katie walked toward him, each step thundering in her chest. David looked up as she stopped in front of him, and what she saw shattered her defenses. There was no arrogance, no power, only raw regret, stripped of pride. "I'm sorry," he murmured, so quietly it was nearly lost in the rain. "I'm scared to trust, scared to lose," he added, his voice cracking. Katie remained silent, letting his words wash through her. She knew he wasn't perfect. Maybe he never would be. But she also knew her own scars ran too deep to demand perfection from anyone. "I'm scared too," she finally said, voice trembling but steady. "And maybe that's exactly why we have to try anyway." The rain intensified around them, washing the streets, the air, and perhaps their hearts. David reached out his hand, a silent offer. No demands, no impossible promises. Katie hesitated only for a moment before taking it, feeling the real warmth against her cold skin. They wouldn't fix everything that night, they both knew that. But as her fingers intertwined with his, Katie chose to believe again. It wouldn't be easy. Pride, fear, and old ghosts still lingered in their souls. But together, maybe they could face old wounds and build something new, something that didn't need to be perfect to be true. As they walked through the rain toward a second chance, a silent pact formed between them. And for the first time in a long while, David and Katie allowed themselves to dream. That night, David didn't return to his cold, silent penthouse. Instead, he walked the streets of Brooklyn beside Katie, discovering a world he'd long ignored. They stopped at a small corner cafe, where the scent of strong coffee and homemade cake warmed the air. They sat by the window, exchanging quiet glances under soft, golden light. For the first time, David let his guard down effortlessly, just existing there with her. Katie spoke of her hard childhood, of the jobs she had taken to pay for school. David listened in silence, admiring the quiet strength she carried in every word. She didn't play the victim, nor was she ashamed of her scars. She wore them like invisible medals. and the more he got to know the woman beyond the simple appearance, the more captivated he became. Every story of struggle, every shy smile was an invitation to stay. At one point, Katie asked about David's childhood, and a shadow crossed his face. He hesitated, staring into an abyss before speaking in a low voice. "My mother meant everything to me. When she died, I promised I'd never need anyone again." The raw pain in his voice cut through Katie like an invisible blade, and she reached across the table. David held her fingers like someone gripping an anchor, allowing himself to falter without shame. Their pasts, filled with loss and scars, created a quiet bridge between them. There, in that modest cafe, two broken souls recognized each other, in their imperfection. David knew he could never see her as just a fleeting distraction again. Katie felt that despite the fear, there was something in him worth the risk. And maybe, they both thought, true courage was loving even with open wounds. When they left the cafe, the rain had stopped, leaving the world fresh and glistening beneath the streetlights. Without thinking, David took off his coat and placed it on Katie's shoulders, a simple, caring gesture. She smiled, feeling safe in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in a long time. They walked side by side, their steps synchronized as if their inner rhythms had finally aligned. And in that quiet walk, they made an unspoken promise to keep going, together, one step at a time. The taxi stopped in front of the small building where Katie lived. Simple, but full of real life. David walked her to the door, his heart heavy, with the desire to stay and the fear of moving too fast. "Thank you for today," Katie said, her voice as soft as the cool, early morning breeze. David just smiled, a real smile, unlike the ones he wore at gala dinners. There was no need for grand words. What they felt already said everything. Before stepping inside, Katie turned around, looking at him one last time under the dim hallway light. "I'm not perfect, David," she said, honesty carved into every syllable. He stepped closer, narrowing the space between them, his eyes shining with restrained tenderness. "Neither am I," he replied, his voice a whisper, but carrying a weight she understood instantly. And then, without haste or urgency, they both smiled. And so, something real began. Winter arrived early that year, painting the city in sharp gray tones. Despite their differences, David and Katie had been building something fragile, yet undeniably real. Every stolen moment, every honest conversation, was a small victory over fear. But deep feelings bring deep risks, and, inevitably, fierce storms, and theirs was about to hit with devastating force. On a freezing morning, Katie arrived at work and found a brown envelope on her desk. No sender, no warning, just a silent weight that froze her stomach. When she opened it, photos spilled out onto the wooden surface. Photos of her and David, walking, smiling. Along with them, a typed note. "Careful, Miss Campbell, his world will destroy you." The words were cold as blades, cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. Her instinct was to ignore it, throw everything away and move on. But old insecurities, buried but never fully gone, began whispering again in her mind. Could it be true? Was she just living a beautiful illusion? Deep down, she knew David carried demons she'd barely begun to uncover. And now, fear threatened to rebuild the walls they had worked so hard to break down. Meanwhile, David was preparing for the most important meeting of the year, completely unaware. He felt different, lighter, more human, and all because of Katie. She was his silent anchor, the reminder that redemption was still possible. That morning, he even thought about asking her to be a permanent part of his life. But fate, cruel and unpredictable, had other plans for them. That night, David invited her to dinner at a discreet restaurant far from prying eyes. Katie hesitated before accepting, the letter's words still burning in her memory. She wore her best simple dress, tied her hair back casually, and left. When she saw him waiting outside with a genuine smile, Her heart nearly gave in, but the shadow of doubt hovered between them, silent, poisonous. During dinner, David seemed different, nervous, almost unsure. He talked about dreams, about building something new, away from the superficial world he had known. Katie listened, moved, but the letter pulsed in her pocket like a bitter reminder. With every kind word, a part of her wanted to believe, and another, guarded and trembling, braced itself for heartbreak. When dessert arrived, David finally found the courage. He took her hand across the table, his intense blue eyes locked on hers. "Katie, I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you in it," he said, his voice trembling. Her heart pounded in her chest, a chaotic mix of love and fear. But before she could answer, fate struck again. A man approached their table, dressed in a dark suit and wearing a poisonous smile. It was Robert Hale, David's ruthless business rival, known for his cruelty and cunning. "What a lovely, unlikely couple," Robert said with fake warmth, casting a calculated look at Katie. David stood up immediately, his body tense like a coiled spring. Katie, frightened, saw a cold fury in David's face she had never seen before. "Leave." "Hale," David growled, his voice low and threatening. Robert just chuckled and tossed a folder of documents onto the table. "Are you sure she knows everything, Walker? The lawsuits, the manipulation, the dirty games?" Katie looked at David, the world around her beginning to spin in slow motion. His silence was deafening, and far more painful than anything Hale could say. David tried to speak, to explain, but Katie was already standing, her face pale and hurt. The photos, the letter, Robert's words, they all clicked together like a cruel puzzle. "You lied to me," she said quietly, her voice breaking from within. "Katie, please listen to me," David begged, but she was already walking away, heart in ruins. That night, so full of promise, collapsed under the weight of doubt and pain. David rushed after her but lost sight of her in the busy street. The cold night air mocked his anguish, slicing deeper than any blade. He stood frozen, alone, as cars sped by and city lights blurred behind unshed tears. Katie, hidden in a nearby alley, wept silently, hating herself for still loving him, and, somewhere between them, hope bled, weak but still beating. Katie walked out of the restaurant without looking back, her breath shallow and her chest burning. The city spun around her, indifferent to the storm rising inside. Every step felt like a blow, every recent memory weighed like chains. She loved David, of that she had no doubt. But was love enough? Could she survive in a world where she'd never truly feel safe? That night, David wandered the streets aimlessly, each corner a reminder of Katie. He passed the cafe where he had seen her smile, the bookstore where they laughed at strange titles. Every memory mocked him now, cruel in its unreachable beauty. Eventually, exhausted, he collapsed onto a park bench, burying his face in his hands. There, beneath a starless sky, David Walker broke for the first time in years. Katie spent the night, wide awake, sitting by the window of her small apartment. She watched the city lights flicker in the distance, wondering where she had lost her way. In her lap lay the photos she'd received, now wet with tears she had refused to cry. She wanted to believe in David, to fight for what they had built. But how do you fight an invisible enemy called doubt? Dawn brought colder air and no answers. Katie knew she needed distance, space to think, to breathe. She decided to leave for a few days, away from him, away from the city. She had to find her strength before deciding if there was still something worth saving. And as she packed a small suitcase, her heart quietly broke all over again. On the other side of town, David was making his own plans. He knew that losing Katie meant losing the only real chance he'd had in years. And he wasn't ready to give her up without fighting for every last drop of hope. He knew words wouldn't be enough. He needed actions, proof, soul. And for the first time, David prepared to give up everything, to save the love he had found too late. David spent the entire day locked in his office, eyes staring blankly out the window. His world, built of steel and concrete, now felt like an empty castle. Katie was the only real part, the only truth he had ever found in the cold. And now, lost without her, he knew he had to do something he had never done before. Strip himself of everything. An apology wouldn't do. He had to offer his entire heart. The first thing he did was cancel meetings, trips, contracts, everything that might distract him. Then he called his lawyer and made a decision unthinkable for any tycoon. He began relinquishing parts of his business tied to questionable practices. Not to impress Katie, but because he wanted to be a man worthy of her and of himself. It was a silent act of redemption, but filled with meaning. Meanwhile, Katie traveled to a small coastal town seeking distance from her pain. She rented a simple room at a family-run inn, far from the noise and lights of the city. She spent hours walking along the deserted beach, feeling the cold wind and salty air. Every step was an attempt to clear her mind, to listen to her heart. But no matter how hard she tried, the memory of David kept echoing inside her. On a gray afternoon, while collecting seashells in the wet sand, she heard someone call her name. She turned slowly, heart pounding, and there he was. David, drenched in sea mist and remorse. He wore no suit, no mask of wealth, just a man, vulnerable and real. Katie froze, unsure whether to run to him or run away. But David's eyes, full of pain and hope, anchored her to the spot. "I came because you're the truest thing in my life," David said, his voice cracking. "I came because I realized that without you, nothing else matters." Katie felt tears burn in her eyes but stayed silent, waiting. David stepped closer, the waves soaking his shoes, and he didn't seem to notice. "I let go of everything. That wasn't worthy of us. For you. For us." He handed her a simple folder, the papers inside still damp from the journey. Inside were proofs, donations to the NGO, social projects he was now funding, severed contracts with corrupt companies. No empty promises, no tricks, just concrete actions. David, the man who had never surrendered to anything, was surrendering here, before her. And Katie felt the ground shift beneath her. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was love. "Not perfect, Katie. I made mistakes, I lied, I hid parts of myself I'm ashamed of," he continued. "But I'm willing to fight every day to be a better man, to be worthy of what I feel for you." His words were shaky, unpolished, so different from the rehearsed speeches he used to give. And it was in that imperfection that Katie found the answer she'd been searching for. It was his truth, raw and brave, that finally reached her. Katie closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the cold wind against her warm face. She remembered all the nights she wished for someone who would truly choose her. Not just want her, but be willing to change for love. And there he was, broken, imperfect, but real, choosing her with no masks. And in that moment, Katie knew her heart had already made its decision. She let the folder fall onto the sand, ignoring the symbolic weight of the documents. She ran to David, throwing herself into his arms with such force that it drew a choked laugh from him. David held her like someone who had finally found home after a long, weary journey. The salty air, the warmth of their embrace, the racing of their hearts. Everything felt intensely real. And there, between a gray sky and cold sand, they silently promised to start again. There were no crowds, no contracts, no spotlight, just two souls trying once more. David kissed her forehead slowly, as if imprinting that promise onto her skin. Katie clung to him, feeling the last of her pride dissolve completely. Yes, it was scary. Love would always be a leap into the unknown, but together, they were willing to jump. David pulled back just enough to look into her eyes and smile. "I love you, Katie," he said for the first time, his voice full of truth. Katie smiled through the tears that now ran freely down her face. "I love you too, David. Even with all your imperfections," she whispered, and never in her life had those words meant so much. The wind carried their laughter into the distance as they walked hand in hand along the shore. The sea, indifferent to human pain, crashed rhythmically against the rocks, an eternal witness. They knew life wouldn't be easy. It never was. But for the first time, they didn't need promises, only each other. And that, finally, was more than enough. Before returning to the city, they spent the night walking the beach, sharing dreams. Small, simple dreams, a house with a porch, a real life full of imperfections. They weren't fairy tale promises. They were human wishes, honest and possible. And with every word exchanged, every smile shared, their love grew, quiet and strong. Love that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. On the drive back to the city, David held Katie's hand like he was holding onto hope itself. She in turn allowed herself to rest in that gesture, letting his presence calm her. They didn't talk much. Their glances and touches filled the silence. Fear still existed, of course, but it was small next to the choice they had made. And for the first time, Katie believed they could build something lasting, even through their falls. They arrived back in Brooklyn on a gray morning where everything looked the same, but everything had changed. David parked in front of the hospital where Katie worked, his eyes full of tenderness. "I'll be waiting for you," he said, knowing she still needed her time and space. Katie smiled, squeezing his hand one last time before stepping out. And, with peace in her heart, she walked inside, knowing that this time she wasn't alone. Winter began to say goodbye to the city when Katie and David finally found their rhythm again. The bare trees lining the sidewalks seemed ready to bloom, as if nature mirrored their story. Katie still worked at the hospital, her spirit steady and strong. David, meanwhile, was rebuilding his empire, now on more honest human foundations. And between them there was a new kind of love, mature, free, and unconditional. It was a clear-skied Saturday when David invited her to see a special place. Katie, curious, accepted right away, unaware of what the mysterious invitation meant. They drove through quiet streets until they reached an open field full of possibilities. There, among green lawns and an unfinished structure, David stepped out of the car with a shy smile. "This is our beginning," he said, extending his hand to her. Confused, Katie looked around and saw a small architectural plan on a makeshift table. It was a community clinic, designed to offer free care to those who needed it most. "I want to build something that matters, and I want it to be ours," he explained, eyes shining with hope. Katie felt warmth flood her chest, moved, not by the scale of the gesture, but by the truth it held. And there, beneath the soft sun, she realized she had nothing left to fear. They spent the day planning the details, laughing at David's wild ideas and adjusting things to reality. Every line in the blueprint, every imagined wall, was a quiet promise that they were in it together. It was more than just a project, it was a symbol of the love they chose to build. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and orange, Katie understood. They belonged to each other. Not because they were perfect, but because they chose love, in spite of everything. Weeks later, the clinic began to take shape, brick by brick, dream by dream. David and Katie were there every day, getting their hands dirty, laughing at their own mistakes. Their life was no longer theory. It was becoming practice, messy, hard at times, but incredibly real. Katie was rediscovering the strength she'd always had, now multiplied by knowing she was no longer alone. And David, for the first time, realized that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was courage. On a cold afternoon, while painting one of the walls, David paused to silently watch Katie. She wore old clothes, her face smudged with paint, and still she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Without thinking, he dropped the brush and pulled her close, kissing her with all the tenderness he'd been saving. Katie laughed against his lips, a light sound, like the first day of spring. And in that unassuming kiss, they sealed a new chapter of their lives. Over time, the clinic became a symbol of transformation in a neighborhood long forgotten by the city. Patients came from all directions, drawn by the hope the place radiated. And whenever someone asked who had the idea, David would simply smile and look at Katie. Because he knew. She was the heart of it all, the spark that had reignited his sleeping soul. And never, not for a second, did he stop being grateful for having found her. On opening night, with the building lit up and the streets alive, David surprised Katie again. In front of everyone, he pulled a small box from his pocket and knelt without fear. The silence that fell over the crowd felt like time itself had paused as Katie covered her mouth in shock. "I don't need a perfect world. I just need you. Imperfect and wonderful as you are," he said. And there, under the lights of the new clinic, he asked her to be his forever. With tears in her eyes and her heart overflowing, Katie said yes without hesitation. The applause that erupted around them seemed distant, an irrelevant echo to what truly mattered. David stood and kissed her slowly, sealing not just a proposal, but an entire story. There, before the world, they were no longer walking wounds. They became healing for each other. And as the future opened before them, they knew they could face any storm together. The days that followed were full of adjustments, laughter, tears, and hard choices. But now every challenge was shared, every fear faced hand in hand. David learned to yield, to trust, to build real bonds. Katie learned to let herself love freely, to trust someone other than herself. Together, they redefined what home meant, a place they held in the palms of their hands. Years later, Katie often remembered the night she thought everything was over. She recalled the pain, the disillusionment, the urge to run away forever. But she also remembered the man who ran after her, not with empty promises, but with real change. And that's why, on a calm morning, walking beside David, she smiled without fear. Because love, after all, was this: seeing beyond appearances and choosing to stay. The love that was born in chaos, grew among ruins, and bloomed through scars. It wasn't storybook love, full of perfect scenes and flawless endings. It was love between real people, built on sacrifice, restarts, and daily courage. And for that very reason, it was the rarest, strongest, and most beautiful kind of all. A love no money could buy, only build. David and Katie kept walking through life side by side, embracing what came. They celebrated small victories, like a child smiling after being seen at the clinic. They comforted each other during failures on the days when fear still came knocking. And most of all, they chose each other every day, never promising perfection. Because love, they had learned, is the quietest choice and the most powerful one. Under the wide sky, as the city resumed its eternal dance, Katie rested her head on his shoulder. David wrapped his arm around her like someone protecting not just a body, but an entire story. And in silence, they gave thanks for the pain, the falls, the scars that had led them here. The wind carried invisible promises, and they welcomed them with open hearts. After all, they were exactly where they belonged, in each other's hearts. The first signs of spring touched New York gently, as if the city too longed for a new beginning. Trees began to bloom, and the wind carried a subtle scent of renewal through Brooklyn's narrow streets. Katie walked to the hospital with lighter steps, her heart less burdened than months before. There were still doubts, of course, but now they lived alongside something new: hope. Hope that love, even imperfect, could be real. From the top of the foundation building he and Katie had created, David looked at the city with new eyes. Before, everything had meant power and control. Now, it meant impact, meaning, and giving. Beside him, projects came to life: clinics, libraries, spaces for belonging. But none of them meant more than the woman who had changed his way of being. It was for her and with her that everything now made sense. That morning, Katie received a note in the familiar handwriting that always made her smile. Today, 5 p.m., at the place where everything started to change. That was all it said. She knew exactly where he would be, at the clinic grounds where they once dreamed together. She dressed slowly, her heart racing like someone about to meet destiny. In her bag, She carried only courage and an overwhelming desire to live the now. When she arrived, David was there, no tie, sleeves rolled up, holding 2 cups of coffee. The setting sun bathed his hair in gold, and for a moment Katie forgot how to breathe. He held out the drink with a soft smile, saying everything without a single word. "Welcome back to our world," he said, looking at her with tenderness. Katie smiled, taking the cup like she was holding more than coffee. She was holding a new beginning. They walked through the still unfinished corridors of the new clinic wing, nearly complete now. David showed her every detail with quiet excitement, like a child proud of his drawing. Katie touched the raw walls, feeling the rough texture that would soon shelter so many lives. In every space, there were traces of their story, the pain and the love they had built. It was more than a social project. It was the visible reflection of an invisible but real love. In the following months, the wedding was planned with no rush, just like them. Intimate, simple, true. On the chosen date, the ceremony took place in the clinic's courtyard, surrounded by friends, patients, and stories. Katie wore a light dress with no sparkles, but with a glow in her eyes that always enchanted. David wore a flower she had picked in his lapel, and a smile never seen in magazines. And when they exchanged vows, there were no empty promises, only eyes that said, "I choose you, always." Life as a couple wasn't a fairy tale, and they knew it. There were hard days, arguments, exhaustion, and uncertainty. But now every hardship was shared, every victory celebrated with coffee on the way porch. Their intimacy grew like the clinic walls, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. And the love born from ruins bloomed on solid ground, nurtured by truth and respect. Years later, on a quiet afternoon, Katie watched David play with children in the foundation garden. He ran awkwardly, pretending to get caught, their laughter echoing like music. She, sitting under a tree, scribbled ideas for new projects in a notebook. She looked at him and smiled, feeling a peace that came not from the absence of problems, but from the presence of love. It was there, in that ordinary moment, that she understood everything. David sat beside her, out of breath, hair tousled, eyes shining like they used to. "Do you still think I dragged you into something too big?" he asked, laughing. Katie rested her head on his shoulder and softly replied, "No. I think we were saved by something even bigger." He kissed the top of her head, like he always did when words fell short. And they stayed there, in silence, listening to the world keep turning, with no rush. The clinic became a model, the project expanded, but their essence never changed. They were still the same, her with her feet on the ground, him learning to walk with an open heart. Sometimes the media tried to turn their story into headlines, but they no longer cared. They knew what they had couldn't be boxed into labels or expectations. It was something just theirs, strong, quiet, and deeply true. Some nights, when the city slept and the world grew quiet, Katie still woke up startled. Old ghosts of abandonment and loss would sometimes return to whisper doubts. But all it took was reaching out and finding David's fingers laced with hers for calm to return. He had his fears too, but he no longer faced them alone. And together, in the dark, they built every new dawn as if laying the foundation of a home. They had learned that love isn't made of public declarations or grand gestures. It's made of presence, of choice, of silent reconciliation after a long day. It's knowing how to apologize, how to wait, how to start over. It's looking at each other with the same tenderness even when the world feels heavy. And above all, it's deciding, every single day, it's still you, and it always will be. On a random morning, as she opened the bedroom window, Katie took a deep breath and let the sunlight warm her face. Behind her, David wrapped his arms around her silently, needing no words. There, in the soft light and the scent of coffee from the kitchen, were the answers that once felt unreachable. Life was still full of uncertainties, but their love was no longer one of them. It was constant. It was a choice. It was finally beyond appearances. And as the sun rose, Katie and David knew what they had wasn't ordinary, it was rare, it was real. It was beyond appearances. If this story made your heart beat faster, like the video, help this love reach more hearts. Share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe and hit the bell for more intense, unforgettable stories. Here, love isn't perfect, but it's real.